Chapter 6. The Politics. The state's needs and motives for a vigorous prosecution of the murder of Wayman Small sprang from the threads and tentacles spreading in all directions into the corrupt culture of Arizona State Prison, with the criminals and crimes intertwined. One crime cannot be understood without understanding another. One feud cannot be understood without understanding another. One gang's actions causes another's reaction. One hit leads to the next until each violent act seems to propagate its successor in a cycle without end. Before long, the sheer number of interconnected crimes, feuds, and frauds leads in all directions, like the flash of a lightning radiating outward in all directions from a bomb's explosion. So it seemed with Tony Serra and Wayman Small, the first and last murder victims of 1977 at Arizona State Prison. Tony Serra on January 4th and Wayman Small on November 30th. Inmate Tony Serra was murdered in plain view of 74 convicts, yet when questioned, no one had seen anything. The shakedown in the immediate aftermath discovered a zip gun and 3 shanks. Before he died, everyone in Arizona had known for months that Tony Serra was willing to talk, for indeed, he already had. Tony Serra, a con man and former associate of land fraud kingpin Ned Warren Sr., was beaten and stabbed to death at his prison worksite Monday, 4 months after he revealed his version of certain Warren activities, reported the January 4th, 1977 edition of the Arizona Republic. The Republic's headlines tied Serra's murder to Arizona's and Warren's legacy of land fraud. Serra's death is the 13th linked to mob or land fraud in the state. The paper reported that before the Serra killing, the most recent was the bombing death of the Arizona Republic reporter Don Bowles. Bowles was fatally injured June 2nd, 1976, when a bomb exploded beneath his car in the parking lot of a Phoenix hotel. The longest-running, most violent, and most reported land frauds in Arizona history were masterminded by Ned Warren, the godfather of Arizona's fraudulent land sales industry, whose exploits single-handedly made synonymous words Arizona and land fraud in the national press during the 1960s and 1970s. By 1977, Warren was dying of cancer and was unlikely to serve any of his 12-year sentence for fraud, still under appeal. Everyone convicted in his swindles sat behind bars, but his name and legacy lived on. The public knew Serra's name well, too, from extensive news reports of Warren's demise. Warren's companies owned land and sold it many times. They repeatedly resold the same land to different customers and then sold each successive new mortgage to a different bank. The companies carried off the fraud for years by never recording any deeds of sale showing the purchaser to be the new owner. Each bank believed it owned good commercial paper with a paying customer who would receive a deed for the land only once all the payments were made on their long-term purchase contracts. The buyers were unsophisticated out-of-state purchasers, most never seeing the land they had bought and never understanding their victimization until they had made years of payments. In the end, no one knew who owned what. Tony Serra was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in prison in August of 1974 for 11 counts of fraud stemming from the operations of Great Southwest Land and Cattle Company, a crooked land firm controlled by Warren. Serra had been the company's sales manager. 2 years into his prison term, Serra had a peculiar change of heart. On August 13, 1976, the Republic reported that prison inmate Tony Serra had given a sworn statement asserting that in 1968, the Maricopa County Attorney, Serra and Warren, had moved a 3-foot pile of records of Arizona's land swindles from the county attorney's office after they had been surrendered to the prosecutor's office by Richard Frost. Serra's revelation offered the tantalizing hint that the records are hidden not far from here, Florence. Prison warden Caldwell was very irate at the prospect of Serra talking and said that this could get a couple of good finks killed. Jim Moran, director of the Arizona Department of Corrections, paid a highly unusual visit to Serra in his cell after this revelation. Then, 3 days after Serra's death, the Republic reported prison director John Moran's denial as an absolute lie, as the content of Serra's posthumously reported letter to his lawyer described visits and threats from Moran and Warren Caldwell. An unrelated story on the same page told of 4 escapees and hostages spotted east of Yuma. Caldwell denied that these escapees could be considered suspects in Sierra's murder, which, though true, nonetheless damned him again, since having to answer so potent a charge was proof of his weakened stature. Sarah's death rang in the 1977 New Year, the opening round in the wildest, most violent year in the history of Arizona State Prison. As with most murders before his, Sarah's murder merited virtually no investigation, and no one was ever successfully prosecuted for his death. But 11 months later, Small's murder started a war against the Aryan Brotherhood. Why the metamorphosis from Inui to war? Too much publicity. After 14 murders and 25 stabbings at Arizona State Prison during 1976 and 1977, politicians were finally forced to act at the Republic's sensational coverage of the carnage that government officials appeared unable to stop. Amidst Arizona's prison crisis, 3 men occupied the governor's chair from October 1977 to March 1978. The first, Raul Castro, vacated the office 1 month before Small's murder to serve under President Jimmy Carter as the U.S. ambassador to Argentina. Then came Wesley Bowling, Arizona's Secretary of State and Castro's constitutional successor. The lovable, ineffectual, over-the-hill Bowling, a bolo-tie Western-style Arizona institution, crowned his 30-year career of public service as Secretary of State by serving as governor for the last 4 months of his life. As Secretary of State, essentially an elected head clerk's job, Bowling couldn't botch a thing so long as he stayed out of the way of his hired clerks, who carried on the office's utterly humdrum business of recording financial statements and counting election ballots. Unexpectedly elevated to the governorship, Bowling did not have time to annoy any constituency during his 4 months in office. Governor Bowling displayed his stripe as a give the public what it wants politician in a speech delivered shortly after his ascension to the governorship, reported November 24, 1977, in the Republic. Speaking to a joint meeting of the Prescott Rotary and the Kiwanis Club, Bowling announced his order to the director of the Department of Corrections to put state prison inmates to work in an effort to control stabbings and other violence. We're going to see that those prisoners go to work down there. All they do is sit around and think up mean things to do to each other. Not to be outdone, Majority Leader Burton Barr introduced a bill requiring inmates to be engaged in productive measures. 6 days later, on November 30th, Governor Bowling filed John Moran as the Department of Corrections Director for failing to solve Arizona's prison crisis and for taking political potshots at the state legislature. Perhaps at the very moment Governor Bowling's pen signed Moran's dismissal order in Phoenix, Terry Farmer and William Goff walked from the print shop to the tag plant with Willard Brashears to identify Wayman Smalls as their intended victim. Or perhaps Farmer and Goff engaged their victim in small talk moments before thrusting the shank into his heart and smashing his skull with the claw hammer. Or perhaps John DeSanti and Bart Goodwin received their orders to Florence for the most challenging investigation of their lives. Or perhaps Wayman Small was murdered at the same time the politicians at the Capitol were crafting their quotes to attack Bowling's firing of Moran. For as the Republic reported, in the legislature, leaders in both the House and Senate accused the governor of using Moran as a scapegoat for a 50-year-old problem and a carcass to hang his hat on. Several legislators called the governor's decision premature and precipitous. In any case, Governor Bowling acted decisively and forcefully when news of Small's murder reached his office. When Governor Bowling fired Moran on the same day that the Aryan Brotherhood murdered Small, the defining moment arrived in the long-simmering crisis of public and institutional confidence. For Moran's immediate replacement, Governor Bowling tapped imported experts from the Texas prison system, calling the Lone Star State system the finest in the world. Ron Taylor, administrative assistant to Texas's prison director, was loaned to Bowling for 90 days to make his recommendations. On January 12, 1978, Taylor announced his immediate recommendations to the House Government Operations Committee, the same committee before which Small had been scheduled to testify. Arizona's Attorney General should prosecute all crimes committed by persons in the custody of the Arizona Department of Corrections. Investigators and attorneys should be assigned to the Department of Corrections to ensure vigorous prosecutions. In addition, I support legislation being drafted to specifically provide for the capital punishment of inmates who kill or conspire to kill another inmate, either in jail or prison. The current level of violence at the state prison is a despicable situation, and I pledge every effort to correct it. On the same day as Taylor's appearance, the legislators got the dog and pony show they'd sought and that Small had volunteered to provide on December 1st, 1977. Prison inmate George Warnock, wearing a black hood, though incongruously his name was given, told the legislative committee that Ned Warren, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Mexican Mafia had all placed contracts on Tony Serra's head before his slaying in prison. Warren for fear of Serra's knowledge of land fraud schemes, the gangs because Serra ripped him off in a heroin deal. When Wes Bolin died in the saddle on March 5, 1978, with the prison crisis still escalating, Attorney General Bruce Babbitt became his constitutional successor. A politician of enormous ambition, Babbitt made or laid a serious run for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1992 and served as President Clinton's Secretary of the Interior from 1993 to 2001. Babbitt could not afford to let a few prison gangsters sully his law and order image, not on his watch, not if his ambitions were to be fulfilled. Throughout Arizona's entire prison crisis, Bruce Babbitt had been the one constant in the highest echelons of the executive branch, having served either as Attorney General or Governor. Babbitt had been the one politician able to expand or curtail Arizona's commitment to prosecute the Florence 11 for the murder of Wayman Small. But Babbitt's career aspirations alone do not explain Arizona's all-out declaration of war on the Aryan Brotherhood on November 30th, 1977. Though certainly Babbitt either lobbied for or didn't resist Governor Bolin's direction that the Attorney General's office take over the prosecution of the Wayman Small homicide. So although pressure to do something about violence at Arizona State Prison didn't begin with the murder of Wayman Small, Arizona's institutional reaction to the murder, from the governor's office to the head of the Department of Corrections, the warden and the captains, lieutenants, and sergeants at Florence, the Department of Public Safety investigators, and finally to the prosecutors at the Attorney General's office, was to declare all-out war on the Aryan Brotherhood and to throw every available institutional asset of the state into the investigation, prosecution, and conviction of its members. The declaration of war coincided with an event that made it impossible to ignore the prison crisis any longer. Just like a homeowner finally calling the plumber after the home's pipes had burst, spilling sewage and fouling the air. Yet those bursting pipes first began with a single drip from a small crack, hard to detect at first and easily ignored for a while. The all-out response to the murder of Wayman Small began after a trickle of prison violence had grown to a flood. The year of Small's murder began with the murder of Tony Serra. Many had speculated that Warden Cardwell and his favorite among the inmates, murderer Gary Tyson, had been complicitous in Serra's murder. By failing to send Wayman Small into protective custody when he knew Small was a marked man, Warden Caldwell again faced conjecture of the same vein. The Tony Serra and Wayman Small attacks had much in common. Both murders occurred during the workday in front of hundreds of prisoners, with the perpetrators aided in both committing the crime and evading detection. As if suddenly struck deaf, dumb, and blind, prison guards found only dead bodies, bloody shanks, and witnesses. Serra and Small were both snitches who told authorities about gang and organized crimes. Warden Cardwell could have prevented both murders by removing either snitch from harm's way, but he may have deliberately chosen not to, for complex political, personal, and institutional reasons. With Small dead and Governor Bolin taking jurisdiction of Warden Cardwell's hands, the struggle to retrieve the asylum from the inmates began. It's one thing if the prisoners are running the institution and only the warden, the guards, and the Department of Corrections know it. That equilibrium may persist and may always remain the natural state of affairs so long as institutions confine the human spirit. But this equilibrium is disturbed and no longer acceptable if public ever comes to believe that the prisoners are running the asylum. When Arizona newspaper stories created the public perception of a system run amok, with prison gangsters freely ordering unprosecutable, cold-blooded shankings of their rivals week after week, politicians had no choice. Now they demanded that names be named, that heads roll, that law and order be restored to the prison, lest they be re-elected. With Wayman Small's murder, the rumble of prison violence had reached a crescendo heard around the state. Black ink had splashed across hundreds of pages of Arizona newsprint. The collective public and political minds demanded that the offensive wail from Florence be silenced.